Small-town America, winter of 1999. The air is crisp and white with snow, falling gently like ash from an old fireplace, coating the brick sidewalks and wraparound porches of the square in front of the town hall. Streetlights cast a warm glow through the frozen mist, illuminating the slow dance of flakes that cling to bundled-up passers-by, their breath floating like faint ghosts in the pale noon light. At the center of this quiet scene, on a worn wooden bench, sits an old man whom everyone knows only as Mr. Weaver. He wears a faded trench coat, too thin for winter, and a soft, ragged cap that barely covers his graying hair. His face, time-worn and lined, gazes blankly at the century-old fountain behind him, its water frozen solid. In his gloved hand rests a dented tin cup filled with a few coins. Day after day, he seems part of the winter landscape, as familiar and fragile as the frost on the windows. Most adults avoid the square. Their heads are too full of errands and worries to pay attention to an old man. Children, taught caution, scurry past, avoiding eye contact. Yet there is one child who doesn't look away. 8-year-old Ethan walks home from school, backpack bouncing against his jacket, when he spots something fluttering from Mr. Weaver's inside coat pocket, a slip of paper, black and white, drifting to the ground like a lost snowflake. Curious, he picks it up and realizes it's a photograph. A young man in a crisp uniform, his posture proud, his eyes resolute. Ethan approaches Mr. Weaver, holds the picture with both hands, so gently it might have been made of glass, and asks, "Sir, is this you, Mr.?" Weaver's head lifts slowly. He looks from the picture to Ethan's wide, honest eyes. In that moment, his eyes glisten, their grey depths wet with memory. Without words, he takes the photo. And for the first time in years, the weight of what it represents settles on him. At that moment, Ethan's mother, Megan, arrives. Her eyes widen when she glimpses the uniform, a U.S. Army dress uniform with campaign ribbons neatly placed, the style unmistakably mid-20th century. She recognizes it, faintly, from stories whispered about her own grandfather, who served in the European theater during World War II. Yet the tales in her family were always muted, cut short by distance or loss. That evening, Megan sits by the window, the photograph resting on her palm. She thinks of her grandfather, how little she knows of him, how his absence shaped her mother's silence. She feels a tremor of something unresolved echoing through the image and through the man who sits on that square, seemingly invisible to all but her son. The next morning, she returns to the square, coffee in hand, the photo in her pocket, and a hope in her heart that what lies hidden in this man's past might also belong, in part, to her family's lost pieces. If this story moves you even half as much as it has moved me in telling it, please like and subscribe. That helps us continue sharing stories that touch the human heart and surprise us with their beauty. And now, take a deep breath. What you're about to hear could change everything. The following morning, the wind swept cold across the square, rustling newspaper pages against lampposts and tossing brittle leaves left over from fall. Megan approached with cautious steps, a thermos of hot coffee in one hand, a paper bag of cinnamon rolls in the other. In her coat pocket, the black and white photo her son had found, now sealed in a small plastic sleeve, like a fragile piece of history. She wasn't entirely sure why she was back. But something about the way the old man had looked at Ethan, or perhaps the way he hadn't looked away, stayed with her through the night, like a quiet echo. Mr. Weaver sat where he always did, at the edge of the square, near the frozen fountain and the old war memorial that most people walked past without reading. His coat was buttoned up, though it barely held out the cold, and he seemed smaller in the morning light, not just from age, but from years of being unseen. When Megan approached, he turned his head, slowly, wary, but not unkind. She sat beside him without asking, keeping a respectful distance. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The town moved around them, cars idling at the intersection, a postman walking his route, someone sweeping the sidewalk in front of the diner. Megan reached into her coat and offered him the photo, carefully, like one might return a folded flag. "My son found this yesterday," she said. "He asked if it was you." Mr. Weaver didn't take the picture immediately. He looked at it first, really looked, and then, as if pulled by an unseen force, took it into his hands. His fingers, though trembling, held the photo with the steadiness of someone who had waited years for this object to resurface. He took a deep breath. I used to be him. Megan looked at him, not with pity, but with patience. Army? She asked softly. He nodded once. 1st Infantry Division, Normandy, 1944. And then the silence cracked. Not loud, not sudden, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man reaching back into a vault he had long since locked shut. Mr. Weaver spoke not like someone recalling history, but like someone returning to it. He told her about the sounds that never left him. The low thud of artillery, the metallic echo of tank treads, the quiet whistle of wind before a mortar hit. He remembered names: Jackson, O'Reilly, Brooks, boys who didn't come home, whose last words were sometimes unfinished jokes or cries for mothers. You hold on to what you can, he said. A face, a laugh, a nickname scratched into a helmet liner. And even that fades. He had received a Bronze Star for bravery under fire after pulling a wounded radio operator out of a burning truck near St. Lo. The photo Megan now held was taken the next morning in front of a temporary field tent after the commander pinned the medal on his chest. The moment frozen in time was one of rare pride, just hours before grief would set in again. War gave me something to do, he said. Coming home took everything away. When he returned to the US, things were different. He was a soldier, yes, but not the kind the town wanted to hear about. The parades had ended, the jobs were scarce, and whatever glory might have awaited him was swallowed by silence, a silence heavier than battle, more enduring than gunfire. Mr. Weaver tried to rebuild. He worked in a garage for a while, then as a night janitor at the school district offices. But something always followed him. A shadow of discomfort, a sense that people didn't know what to say to a man who had seen too much or worse, didn't want to know. Over time, the work dried up, the war stories stopped, and eventually, so did the calls. I stopped telling people I served, he said. It just made them shift in their seats. Megan listened without interrupting. She felt something tightening in her chest, not just sorrow, but recognition. Her grandfather had stopped speaking of the war, too. He kept a footlocker sealed in the garage that no one dared open. And now, sitting beside Mr. Weaver, she felt as though she were unlocking more than one silence at a time. He told her about the few things he kept with him. The medal, a folded American flag given to him at a friend's funeral, and the photo, all tucked away in an old leather pouch he never let out of reach. That picture, he said, almost a whisper, was the last time I saw myself. Megan didn't know what to say. She placed the coffee beside him. He didn't drink it right away, just looked at it, then at her. Most people just drop a coin and keep walking, he said. Your boy. He stopped. She nodded. He has a good heart. Mr. Weaver smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the mouth, but softens the eyes. He reminded me who I used to be. In the days that followed, Megan found herself returning to the square more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ethan. She brought soup in thermoses, extra gloves, once even a heavy wool blanket. But mostly, she brought time, something few had ever offered the man everyone simply called Mr. Weaver. And in exchange, piece by piece, he gave her his story. Not the kind you read in history books or watch reenacted in documentaries. His story came in fragments, in long pauses, in memories that slipped out sideways, uninvited, and sometimes in quiet silences more telling than words. There was no beginning, no end, just a slow unraveling of a war that never truly let go. He spoke of the Normandy beaches, of the wet sand and the stench of gasoline and seaweed and blood, of orders shouted over gunfire and the way the ground shook when artillery hit too close. He recalled faces, voices, routines, not for their drama, but for their mundanity, the brushing of boots, the rattling of mess kits, the jokes told too loudly at night because fear had to be laughed away or it would grow teeth. People think war is all noise, he said once, but sometimes The worst part is the silence after a battle. That's when you realize who's not answering anymore. Megan didn't always ask questions. She knew instinctively that this wasn't an interview. It was confession, or maybe release. And while some days he spoke at length, others he barely spoke at all. But even in those silences, something was shifting. A man who had once been only a fixture in the background of town life was slowly, irrevocably becoming someone real. He told her about the dreams, not every night, but often enough that he came to fear falling asleep. The sounds came back, the distant rumble of tanks, the sudden snap of a twig underfoot, the scream that didn't come from his own throat, but someone else's. Sometimes, he said, the worst part wasn't the dream itself, but waking up and finding that it still followed him through the day. One afternoon, when Ethan was at school and the square was nearly empty, Mr. Weaver reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small metal tin, once used to hold cough drops. Inside were 4 items, the old photograph Ethan had found, a bronze star, scratched and dulled with age, a letter, folded and yellowed, addressed to him but never opened, and a slip of paper with names written in pencil, their letters faded but still legible. "These are my drawers," he said quietly, gesturing to the contents, "not the wooden kind, the kind in your head, the ones you keep shut because you're scared of what'll fall out if you open them." He opened the letter, carefully with trembling fingers. Megan leaned closer but didn't interrupt. The letter was dated March 1946, signed by someone named Thomas R. It spoke of Berlin, of a missed train, of a promise to meet again after the war, and a question that would never be answered. "Did you make it home?" "He was my best friend," Mr. Weaver said. "We swore we'd find each other after it was all over, but I was already locked up in a VA ward by the time that letter came, too broken, too angry. I didn't trust anybody, not even the people trying to help me." Megan felt her breath catch. She thought of her own grandfather, a quiet man who rarely left his room, who polished a pair of boots every week even after his legs failed him, who once shouted in his sleep in German, though he'd never spoken the language. And suddenly she saw the same pain mirrored in Mr. Weaver's face. He never married, never had children. "The world," he said, "always seemed too fragile for someone like him to step back into." He had tried, once, with a woman named Ruth, a schoolteacher who made him feel like something more than what the war had left behind, but he pushed her away. He couldn't explain the darkness, and no one wants to live with a ghost. "I started fading out after that," he said. "One job lost turned into 2, a couple missed appointments, a few too many bottles. Then the letters stopped. The calls stopped. People forget you, and you start forgetting yourself." But then came Ethan, a child who didn't know to be afraid, who hadn't yet learned to look away. And suddenly, Mr. Weaver was no longer invisible. "That photo," he said, holding it up to the winter light, "was the last time I looked like someone I recognized." He returned it gently to the tin, placed the letter beside it, and closed the lid with care. "But lately, when your boy sits beside me, when he listens, really listens, I start to think maybe that version of me isn't gone." He looked at Megan, his eyes steadier now, like they belonged to a man climbing back into himself after decades of being lost in the fog. "Maybe I've just been waiting for someone to ask the right question." There was something about the way Mr. Weaver said the name Thomas R. that wouldn't let go of Megan. The way his voice dipped into silence afterward, as though the sound of it reached into a room he hadn't dared enter in decades. That night, long after Ethan had gone to bed, Megan sat in the attic of her mother's house, surrounded by cardboard boxes, half-open photo albums, and the dust of 3 generations. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she would know it when she saw it. She found it in an envelope, tucked inside a rusted tin lunchbox. The envelope was addressed in the careful handwriting of her grandfather, Thomas Robert Walker, postmarked April 1946, with no return address. It had never been opened. The name on the front stopped her cold. "Mr. Walter Weaver, Columbus, Ohio." Her hands trembled. She opened the envelope and inside was a letter filled with warmth and worry. It spoke of reunion, of survival, of a plan to meet in D.C. by the Lincoln Memorial, just like they'd promised during their last night in the field hospital in France. There were jokes in the margins, mentions of songs they used to hum, a final line, scribbled almost nervously. "If you made it home, write back. If you didn't, I'll keep waiting a little while longer." Megan couldn't breathe. The man on that bench, Mr. Weaver, wasn't just a forgotten soldier. He had been part of her family's story all along. He had known her grandfather, loved him maybe, carried his memory in silence through half a century. The next day, she brought the letter to the square, sealed again in a clean envelope, and handed it to Mr. Weaver without a word. He didn't speak either. He just stared at the handwriting, the postmark, the name. His fingers touched the paper like it might vanish if held too tightly. When he finally opened it, his lips moved as he read, but no sound came out. A minute passed, then another. And when he folded it slowly and placed it back in the envelope, he looked at Megan not with surprise, but with something closer to relief. "I thought he'd given up on me." "He didn't," she said quietly. "He never stopped waiting." They sat in silence for a long time. The city moved on around them, buses pulling up, school bells ringing, the chatter of life in motion. But on that bench, time slowed, and what had been fragmented began, quietly, to heal. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Weaver began to open up more, not only with Megan, but with Ethan too. The boy insisted on visiting him every afternoon after school. Sometimes he brought drawings, tanks, helmets, battlefields, other times just stories from class. And Mr. Weaver listened, really listened. And when he spoke, it wasn't just of war. He told Ethan about Thomas, the boy from Kentucky who could play Moon River on a harmonica, who always saved the last bite of chocolate from his care package to share. The man who once carried him half a mile through mud and gunfire after he was wounded. The friend who gave him laughter in a place where hope was a rare commodity. "We promised each other we'd meet again," Mr. Weaver said once, his voice soft. "But promises are fragile things in wartime." Ethan listened as only children can, with the kind of reverence adults often lose. He didn't ask too many questions. He just held the moments like they were treasures. One rainy afternoon, Megan brought a photograph she'd found in the attic. It showed her grandfather, grinning, arms slung around the shoulder of a younger man in uniform. They were standing near a camp tent, sun in their eyes, alive with the stubborn joy of people who had no idea how much they would lose. Mr. Weaver took the photo with shaking hands. "That was us," he said. "That was the day before everything changed." In the corner of the photo, almost out of frame, was the same field tent where his medal ceremony had taken place. The same place the other photo had been taken. They began connecting the dots, letters, names, locations. Megan found more correspondence in her mother's attic, some of which mentioned Walt as a kind of guardian angel in the field, someone who watched over the injured, even when the medics couldn't get to them. Stories her family had never told, not out of shame, but because no one had ever asked. And so Megan began to ask. Not only Mr. Weaver, but others, veterans in the community, elders in her neighborhood, even her own mother. And in doing so, she saw something unfold, a mosaic of memory that had long been locked away, now coming into the light, because one boy picked up a photo and asked a simple question. It was Megan's idea to bring Mr. Weaver into Ethan's elementary school. She didn't suggest it out of pity or charity, but out of something deeper, the recognition that stories like his, heavy with silence and memory, were vanishing too fast. At first, Mr. Weaver resisted. He wasn't a speaker, he said, not a man who wore his past with ease, but Megan assured him he didn't need to talk like a historian, he just had to tell the truth. So one Tuesday morning in late March, he stood at the front of a brightly lit classroom, flanked by colorful art projects and alphabet charts. The children fidgeted in their chairs, unsure what to expect from the thin, stooped man in the oversized coat. Ethan sat in the front row, back straight, eyes shining. Mr. Weaver didn't open with facts or dates. He simply held up the photograph, the one Ethan had found on the pavement months earlier, and let the room fall silent. "This is me, a long time ago," he said. "But it's also not, because the man in this photo thought he knew what his life would look like. He didn't, and so he told them, not about battles, not about blood, but about waiting, about missing, about the strange quiet that follows a gunshot, and the even stranger silence that comes when the war ends and no one wants to ask what it did to you." He spoke of friends whose names aren't in books, of jokes told in foxholes, of letters never answered, and finally, of how a little boy picking up an old photo brought it all back to life. The children didn't fidget anymore. They leaned forward. They listened. "I used to think no one wanted to hear this," he said, "but now I know you do, and maybe that's enough." When he finished, the room was so quiet that even the hallway noise seemed distant. Then, slowly, the applause began. Ethan stood and walked up to him, reaching out. Mr. Weaver took his hand, gently, like accepting a medal. That day changed everything. The school invited him back. More classes listened. Local parents started attending. The principal asked if he'd be willing to share during Veterans Day. A newspaper editor ran a short column, and Megan, without even realizing it, began writing it all down, collecting memories not just for her son, but for everyone who needed to remember what war really costs. Mr. Weaver changed too. He didn't stop sitting on the bench. It was still his place, his pause in the rhythm of the day. But now, people sat beside him, talked, thanked him. Teenagers brought coffee. Veterans nodded as they passed. He was no longer invisible. One afternoon, Ethan brought him a small box, a simple wooden case, stained dark, with Mr. Weaver's initials carved into the top. Inside were the photograph, the medal, the unopened letter from Thomas, and Ethan's own drawing of Mr. Weaver smiling. Mr. Weaver's hands trembled when he lifted the lid. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said, "I thought these were the last things I had, but maybe they're just the first things I'll pass on." He looked at Ethan. "I don't have a family, but if I did, I'd want them to be like you." Spring arrived slowly, as it often does in small towns, not all at once but in fragments. The smell of fresh earth after rain, the first robin's call at sunrise, the gentle rustle of new leaves in trees that had stood bare through long months of silence. On the bench near the square's old fountain, where he had sat almost every day through wind and snow, Mr. Weaver had not been seen for nearly a week. Megan felt it before she knew it. A quiet in the square that wasn't the same, not the usual calm of early morning, but a stillness filled with absence. When she walked by one morning and saw the bouquet resting gently on the bench, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine, her breath caught in her throat. The town manager confirmed what she already suspected. Mr. Walter Weaver had passed away in his sleep at the small shelter where he'd been staying temporarily, finally convinced to accept a warm room after a particularly cold night. He was found with his coat folded neatly at his side, the wooden box Ethan had given him clutched softly in his arms. He had left no official next of kin, no will, no family on record. But Megan knew that wasn't true. They held a memorial for him at the school. The same children who once giggled at the idea of a story from the war now sat in solemn rows, each wearing a small poppy on their collars. The principal spoke, but it was Ethan who read the final words. His voice trembled, but he didn't pause. He used to sit alone, and now we remember him together. Mr. Weaver didn't have a family, but we became one, and we will never forget. The square changed after that. On the bench where he once sat, the town installed a small bronze plaque, just a few words, chosen carefully by Megan and Ethan together. Here sat Walter Weaver, soldier, friend, memory keeper, forgotten by many, remembered by those who truly listened. Megan published the full story a few weeks later in the Sunday edition of the local paper. The headline read, "The photo in his pocket and the child who saw him." The response was overwhelming. Letters from readers flooded in, not just from town, but from other states. Veterans, teachers, grandchildren who had never known their families' stories. People who realized they had passed by their own Mr. Weaver for years without stopping. Ethan, now a little taller, still walks by the bench on his way home. Sometimes he sits, sometimes he leaves a drawing. Sometimes he just whispers, "I remember," because in the end, that's what Mr. Weaver left behind. Not medals or monuments, but memory. A legacy built not on the roar of battle, but on the quiet bravery of being honest, of being present, of letting someone in. And all it took was a boy who didn't look away. We publish new videos every day, true stories that move, inspire, and remind us of what matters. Subscribe and stay with us.